Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mr. Alex Vatanka, Iran Program and Senior Fellow, Frontier Europe Initiative at the Middle East Institute, and founding director of the Iran Program at the Middle East Institute, more importantly. And we're going to focus our discussion today, Alex, on all things Iran. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Great to be with you.
Great. Let's just backtrack perhaps 3 or 4 months and take our sort of launch point, if you like, in June, because I'd like to sort of talk a little bit geopolitically, stability-wise here in the Gulf. Of course, we had the attacks on Iran in June, which were over in 10 to 12 days. And since then, it seems that it's been all quiet on that front, with a lot else going on, obviously, in the region. But in terms of where that was left, from your point of view, geostrategically, should oil markets, should investors be nervous that we could have a repetition of what we saw in June, or are we now in a new period of stability around that geography?
Look, it's really hard to answer that question because, again, as so much else in life, it depends who you ask. I can tell you, watching clearly what the Iranian debate looks like, they're saying, and they're publicly announcing this almost daily to their public, that war could happen anytime. They're preparing the public opinion. War could happen anytime. This is not done and dusted. So to your point about stability, certainly if you're sitting in Tehran, the message is that the Israelis are still looking for ways to resume conflict. Because again, I think that's the dominant viewpoint inside the Iranian regime, that Israel is essentially after regime change. And they have 3.5 years with a president of American White House, Donald J. Trump, who is essentially open to hearing Israeli arguments why regime change in Tehran would make so much sense for the United States, for Israel, for Middle East, for world peace, as they would put it. So that's the Iranian point of view, that regime change is ultimately what Israel wants. They're looking for that opening so they can resume the conflict, if you will.
I mean, do you really, okay, that's what the Iranians could believe that, and I would certainly understand why the regime there is saying that to its domestic population. But given what happened in June, and then given what we saw in Qatar more recently, from the US standpoint, surely they do not support any further turbulence in the Gulf countries or something that will impact its Gulf allies. And certainly countries like Saudi Arabia don't want Iran to be attacked, and they certainly didn't want Qatar to be attacked. So can we assume that from that point of view, the Israelis have got the message from the US?
I'm not sure if they have. I don't think the Israelis think that it's impossible for Israel to bring the United States into a new round of conflict with Iran. So that I think is the starting point for the Israelis. That Trump is looking for the big deal with Iran. The Iranians are not giving him that big deal, and there is your opportunity if you Israel. Now the pretext and timing, all that needs to be decided. We know that Israel took a number of blows from Iran during the 12-day war. Maybe they need to prepare themselves for a new round of conflict. The Gaza war is kind of being still not completely done, but it's being done. And again, if you're sitting in Tehran, once the Gaza situation is under control, is that the moment for Israel to look for a way to convince Trump that, look, and again, this is a really important point. From Israel's point of view, the message is very easy to sell, if you will, to a person like Donald J. Trump, that here is an Iranian regime that is hated by its own people. If you get rid of it, you have a market of 90 million people, and the rest of the Middle East and the rest of the world is going to welcome that. The question is, how do you bring it about? How do you sell it? And I'm not sure if the Israelis are there yet.
Yeah, and I mean, the question is what replaces the regime, and that could be a very unstable situation for the Arab Gulf as well. I mean, talking about sort of the Iranian regime, where are its proxies positioned today? Of course, we've seen Syria, the new government there, we've seen Hezbollah essentially mostly dismantled in Lebanon. Still some activity by the Houthis, but again, would you say that after what happened in June and what may be happening behind the scenes with Iran negotiations, where are its sort of regional alliances and proxies positioned today? Are we in a new state going forward of those?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, if you take him case by case, it's not done. Hezbollah is not done in Lebanon. In Syria, clearly the situation is much different, but there are reports that they're trying to rebuild what they can. So much depends on what Ahmad Shara gets to do. If that country sort of faces stability, that's going to become much harder for Iran to sort of penetrate. So much is outside of Iran's control, essentially, in some of these places. The Houthis right now, probably the one group that stands out as the most capable Iranian proxy, if you will. But whether Iran uses the Houthis, if you will, and to what extent it can use the Houthis, because we shouldn't forget the Houthis have plenty of independent agency here, but also depends on the bigger picture. Is it if the Iranian decision is to double down on the proxy network model, if you will, which arguably hasn't delivered for them, but the Houthis will become relevant. If they decide to go down the track of diplomacy, talk to the Trump administration, then the Houthis will not be so relevant.
Yeah.
That's the final strategic decision that, again, I'm not sure if Ali Khamenei and the IRGC leadership have made yet. We shouldn't forget, this is an Iranian regime that's still shell-shocked from the 12-day war.
Absolutely. And what about economically? Of course, these proxies need funding, and Iran has been able to do that in the past. Of course, it's still exporting oil, its main commodity. Sanctions don't seem to be kicking in too much there. But from a financial, economic point of view, what is the Iranian regime's position today? Same as it has been for the last few years. Do sanctions remain in place, but there's a system of adjustments that's happened in the economy, or does it feel a bit more economically squeezed?
Oh, it's economically very much squeezed, and you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to President Pezeshkian and everybody else in the Iranian regime. They're in a very bad place when it comes to the state of economy. Are they on the brink of falling over? That's a different situation. In fact, the latest reports that I've seen in terms of oil exports suggest that they sold more oil in September than they have done for a very long time. So they're getting the bare minimum in terms of selling crude oil, particularly to China, because they're giving their discounts to the Chinese, and the Chinese do want to, it seems, to keep this Iranian regime alive. I mean, China is not ready to give up on Iran, and nor the Russians for that matter. So you got to keep that in mind. There are two pretty important, powerful players out there on the international stage, Russia and China, that do not want to see this Iranian regime crumble. And that matters in the context that we're talking about.
Well, absolutely it matters, of course. I mean, China and Russia are Iran's two big allies, let's say. But China and Russia also have relationships with Gulf countries. They have relationships with the US. They're negotiating. Russia isn't negotiating with the US, but it's got the sanctions issue that is back and forth, and China is negotiating a trade deal with America. How is that triangle, I suppose, being formulated going forward? We've got all these bilateral relationships, strong ones between these powers, including Iran and Saudi, that I want to touch on a bit later. But so I know you're an Iranian expert, but what is China's perspective, do you think, on the Middle East at the moment? It hasn't been very outwardly outspoken on trying to be a peacemaker, if you like, recently, whether it's the June occurrences, whether the Gaza thing. What do you think the Chinese outlook on this is, from a sort of energy security point of view as well, and its relationship with the Gulf countries?
Yeah, let me just point out that what I'm hearing from sources in Iran is that the Chinese are very quietly doing a lot more in helping Iran to rebuild, particularly some of its defense capabilities, than we read in the news. And again, that is quite telling. China is quietly doing a lot more helping Iran rebuild, which might actually be quite informative in terms of figuring out why there is this level of Iranian confidence when it comes to sort of rejecting Trump and his overtures for the diplomatic sort of track. Look, fundamentally, China sees the Gulf states, pretty much everybody else in the Middle East, as easier to deal with just because they don't have to worry about all these sanctions that are imposed on Iran. But the other big truth here is Iran is for China to have. There is no competition, essentially, when it comes to whereas the Gulf states, they are essentially on the American side. And the Chinese know that. So yes, the Chinese are taking advantage of what they can in terms of deals, at least in the short to medium term. But if this world of ours becomes one where everybody has to choose sides between China and the United States, I think the Chinese probably think the Gulf states will choose the United States. Iran doesn't have that choice. Iran, by default, will go with the Chinese. And again, that matters if you're sitting in Beijing.
What about the Iranian-Russian cooperation? I mean, Russia can't afford these, it's very busy funding its own war, and obviously is under economic strain to an extent. But of course, historically a supporter of Iran and its proxies as well. Is there any influence there in terms of regional security? Russia has been very much sidelined in the region in the recent months.
Just pointing out here that Russian-Iranian relations, it's so multi-layered, it's so complicated. There's so many different, ways of looking at it. There's a long history of suspicion between the two countries going back centuries, which really doesn't exist when it comes to Iran and China. So Russia is a different animal here, particularly on the economic front. There's not much the Russians can do for the Iranians. I mean, they're essentially competitors of Iran when it comes to oil and petrochemical exports and so forth. What Russia does have is that kind of diplomatic cover. And we see that. I mean, we've just seen that this week where Russia and China came back and said, the nuclear agreement of 2015, so-called JCPOA, has now been completed. Get all these sanctions off Iran, IEA, give Iran a break. These are the types of things that the Russians can do to sort of give Iran confidence, if you will. They can't do what China does for Iran economically, but they can provide some diplomatic cover. But I also want to add, the issue of Russia is very much one that has been fought over heavily in Tehran. The Russians have some friends, but I would say they're a minority. They have many more enemies inside the Islamic Republic. And I'll throw in people like Hassan Rouhani, Javad Zarif, others, who are suspicious of the Russians, who believe Russia uses Iran as a card in its overall sort of bargaining with the United States and the West. So Russia very much much more of a complicated situation as compared to China. But for now, the Russian and Chinese are arguably the two entities that are giving someone like Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, or the IRGC commanders that weren't assassinated in 12-day war, the sort of confidence that they still seem to have to sort of think that they can write this latest set of tensions out.
Okay, and what about, Alex, Saudi-Iranian relations? Before the Gaza war or the bombardment of Gaza started 2 years ago, the Saudis were tipped to be perhaps one day joining the Abraham Accords with Israel at the same time, making peace with Iran, and those relations were very much, being set back sort of to their natural track, if you like, after the last few years of difficulties. Where's Saudi at now, especially with its relationships with the US? Its financial relationship with the US, investment, etc., which obviously has taken a boost also in the last year or so. Where would you say their stance is? We know where Iran is, probably wants to make peace with Saudi and have its Gulf allies backing it. But what about Saudi Arabia? What kind of position is it in?
I think the Saudis, like pretty much most countries in the region, do want to see an Iran that is economically more of a partner than is the case today, because Iran does have potential. I mean, as a marketplace, as a place where you can invest and buy and sell goods to and so forth. But you got these American sanctions in place. And I mean, this has been true for decades. When countries are asked to choose between closer ties with Iran and upsetting the Americans, they invariably choose not to upset the Americans. And I think that's true for the Saudis. They have long-term economic plans. They know the United States is far more important for their plans than Iran is. And yet Iran is right there geographically. It's a big neighbor. It can be a tremendous source for sort of destabilization, if you will. It can be a spoiler for what Saudi Arabia wants to do on the economic front. We just saw that a few years ago.
Of course. I mean, Saudi cannot proceed fully with its Vision 2030, the new Middle East economic corridor, etc., with Iran, an unstable Iran. And I would assume that would be the priority for Saudi Arabia, especially given its investment plans. Now the oil price has dropped, it's having to pare back that investment. It's a huge consideration. The US relationship surely is pretty cemented for Saudi Arabia.
Right, absolutely. So again, this is, I think, where the Saudis are at. They are, make sure Iran doesn't become a spoiler, doesn't seize ships, doesn't create question marks for investors that are looking at investing in Saudi Arabia. Play nice with the Iranians. There'll be lots of summits where Iran might be even invited. There'll be visits and so forth. But look for the hard data. Do you see Saudi investment in Iran? Yeah, to my knowledge, that's not happening.
What about U.S. security for Saudi? Because despite all the bromance of visits and investments, bilateral investments, the two or three incidents that we've seen recently in the last recent years, under Trump at least, and under his first administration, they did not come to Saudis. I mean, maybe they didn't have to come and things dissipated. But when we had the attacks on the Aramco facilities, for example, a few years ago, should Saudi be nervous about the security guarantees that it's getting from the US? Obviously, that's something it's currently working on as well.
I don't know why we should expect this second Trump administration, which I think is actually considerably different than the first Trump administration, because it just has a much more of a free way of doing things than it was the case when Trump was in the White House last time.
No, it's unchecked. Nobody's stopping them, are they? There's the system in the US doesn't, and the international community is not speaking up either.
And if you look at what's happened between Washington and Doha with the sort of reaction to the Israeli strikes in Doha and how the Trump administration really got upset, they got upset primarily because they thought that the Israeli action was obviously undermining American interest in that country. And the same kind of interests are at play when it comes to Saudi Arabia. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if the same kind of message is going from Washington to Jerusalem saying, watch out that you might undermine our interest in Saudi Arabia. Is that a ironclad security guarantee? Of course not, because it would be much more informal. But it's, again, in spirit is the same thing, that there's a Trump administration here that's sort of looking in terms of foreign policy as something you can measure in financial terms, metrics, and Saudi Arabia is a big player in that, and no different than, say, the Qataris. The Qataris are getting all the headlines now, but I don't see why they will be that different as a partner in the perspective of the Trump administration. Should Saudi Arabia need something the way the Qataris just did in terms of reassurances that they're safe, that they're considered an American partner in that part of the world?
And do you, if you were to be a betting man, would you say that we will have a ceasefire in Gaza, in the region this year, this side of December? And of course, the significance of that are many things, but one is that that could then be the trigger for peace with Iran between the Gulf and even Israel and Iran. I mean, how confident are you in long-standing peace being achieved now after everything that we've seen in the last 2 years?
So many moving parts to this, as you know better than me. So it's really, really difficult to say where we're going to be. But I can say this: we haven't been this close for a very long time. And just listening to Hamas leaders and where the region is, and how unable Iran is to act as a spoiler in the Arab-Israeli or the Hamas-Israeli dynamics, all those things to me suggest that there's a real possibility here for something that is sustainable as a peace agreement going forward. And I would say this is a great opportunity for countries in the region, the likes of Saudi Arabia, others, and tell the Iranians, look, the Muqawama, the axis of resistance, the armed struggle against Israel has been done and tested for decades. It doesn't deliver. The better way of helping the Palestinian people is to create the sort of diplomatic momentum necessary to create the conditions when Israel comes to the table and gives the Palestinians a fair deal. That is what I think the Iranians would probably actually want to happen as well, because they're looking for off-ramp. Their axis of resistance has turned out to be a disaster for foreign policy. So if the region can find a way to bring Iran on board on this issue, it can actually have a bigger impact and sort of, if you will, help this Iranian regime put its revolutionary rhetoric and foreign policy of the last half a century maybe aside and look to nation building at home at a critical time when you have an 86-year-old supreme leader who's looking at, departing the stage. Yeah. And the leadership needs to think what's best for them, for their survival and for the country as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, well, exactly. I mean, the country's survival, let's say economic survival, again, you had the IRGCs who run, the economic branch, if you like. And the sticking point has been the Israeli-Palestinian question, but also the dogma of the Iranian regime that they would not let go of, and yet the economic pressure to do that obviously has increased. I mean, just to circle back domestically to Iran, and the pressure on the regime there from an economy point of view, if there isn't an external regime change imposed, could we see? I mean, there is talk of a handover to the next generation by the regime that would be sort of a way of a regime change, but not necessarily a complete shift, but to have a new leader that can then be seen to be having a new outlook on relations between the country and others. Is that in the works at all? There's a lot of talk about that.
Yeah, look, when I look at the Iranian regime today, I see a tiny, loud, very loud minority, about 5% or so of Iranian society that let's call them the hardliners, the Saeed Jalili faction of Paydari and so on, without getting too much into the weeds. But you got that loud group that still believes the way forward is to kind of, fight the United States, bring about change in the global order and so forth. But they are tiny in terms of the vast majority of Iranian society, including a good part of the state machinery inside this regime, that have come to conclude that they need to change course. So will that result in some kind of a gradual change? I think that gradual change is happening right now. Let me give you one example. The mandatory hijab, the mandatory veil, it's not being implemented anymore in Iran as we speak. That's huge. We shouldn't underestimate. This has been a pillar of the Islamic Republic.
Absolutely.
It's not been implemented. It's all you need to know. The regime knows that he can't fight its own people and the Americans and the Israelis at the same time. He needs to choose. And it's coming at a very critical time. You got, again, someone who's been in power since 1989. He's 86. He might be around for many more years to come, but he might not. So the short end of the story is factions in this Iranian regime are preparing for the day after Khamenei. And I would bet, if I was, to your point about being a betting man, I would bet the ones who are in majority, who want big change, might actually have a shot at bringing about a situation where the country takes a turn away from the past into something hopefully much more to the taste of the average Iranians.
Alex Vatanka, Iran Program and Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's been great to have your insights on Iran. That's wonderful. Thanks so much.